It is so good to be with you today. I don't know about you guys. I live and work in sort of South Central North Carolina, and we've been blessed with sort of an early fall spring day. It's about 75 here with a gorgeous blue sky. And I just, if you're like me, when days like this come during the winter or late winter, you get a real urge to go outside and do something fun. So being inside and doing Zooms and other business can feel challenging on beautiful days like this. Yeah, thanks, Tina. Got to make tough choices. But I'm grateful for you joining us, and I'm certainly optimistic that your community is grateful to you for leaning in and contributing to the learning that's going to go on in the prevention world. Just out of curiosity, while we're getting ready to get started, if you wouldn't mind, for those of you, if you would feel comfortable, putting maybe a thumbs up emoji either on the screen or in the chat. How many of you are actually serving in or on a community prevention team or in a community prevention role somehow? Can you just, yeah, fantastic. A lot of you. You bet. Thank you for doing that. Um, I, I will tell you that prevention is my most favorite subject. It is the thing that I went to school for many decades ago in hopes that I could get involved in building and supporting prevention systems. So having an opportunity to be with you in conversation about that really gives me great joy. So thank you so much. Want to just, Zenaida, I see your hand. I'm not sure if that's a question or just recognizing that you're on a prevention system. Okay. Um, I want to just very quickly, you can read my bio. This is not about me. This is about you guys in California. I just want to say that I'm a bit of a unicorn in that I come from a very diverse world of child welfare and child and family behavioral health, juvenile justice. I've also helped start and was executive director for a couple of nonprofits. And so those particular experiences centered me on the real importance of what it takes to do community-driven, community-focused work well. And that was probably the happiest time in my life. I loved being in communities. I loved learning what I didn't know about how to work well in communities and building those partnerships to really tackle the complex issues that people, and just in their day-to-day lives, have to negotiate. And so that community experience really shaped the values that I bring to this work and also the way that we're going to talk about this work today. I am, by definition, an implementation practitioner, implementation science practitioner these days, which means we're going to try to marry this idea of what you probably need to be thinking about based on what science informs us relative to what we ought to do when we're designing and building and operating effective prevention systems. So this is not so much a technical assistance session, but a thinking session around sort of three levels of this. Many of you have been in it for a few years. FFPS and the All County letters came out in 2022. And it's been going fast paced for the last almost 4 years. Um, so some of you got a head start and you are well into your prevention systems. Some of you may be just beginning and are trying to understand what's the best way to go about this. And likely some of you are in the middle of it, where you've been making good progress, but you have a number of milestones to achieve and significant things to deal with in order to bring it fully to life. So depending on where you are, this presentation is geared for all of that because it's meant to help you see if you're deeply into it, the concepts and elements that we're going to cover today are sort of checkpoints, benchmarks, milestones you can use to ask yourself, did we consider this? Do we take this into account? Are we doing this well? Do we need to be more formal and structured in this way to do what we're hoping to accomplish? For those of you who are starting out in the design mode, it's can this framework really help us begin to think about the nuts and bolts? How do we apply a systematic, deliberate, well-planned framework for planning our prevention system, our community engagement strategies, and developing the things we need to do, not just to comply with FFPS and FFPSA, but to truly deliver on the needs and uh, sort of desires that communities benefit from when folks gather together to try to support families and children. And for those of you in the middle, you can do a little bit of both. You can say, I know a fair amount about this, but these can be sort of quality checks or intellectual benchmarks and milestones for are we hitting our stride in doing this? So I hope that makes sense. It's sort of a one size fits most when you think about it that way. So it serves as a check and balance or a planning tool, depending on how you take it. It also helps set the stage for the systematic application of implementation science as embedded in the practice of building prevention, collaboratives, coalitions, planning teams, whatever term you want to use. It is heavily implementation science informed, but that doesn't mean it's rigid. Implementation science often delivers frameworks and strategies which tend to serve as guidelines and roadmaps for how you do what you do. But be assured that all implementation is local. Everything has to be adapted, adopted, tailored to every local context. So what we're offering today is not the cookbook, the recipe, the prescription for how it fits every community. We like to say that if you've seen one community, you've seen one community. Every community is different. And so everything that we're going to share, of course, is tailorable and tailored to the context that you're going to be working in. So let's get started. On the screen are the shared slides that we had in the presentation. I did mention to Angelica that I've added some notes in the PowerPoint that I'm using, and I'm happy to make this PowerPoint presentation available to you. I know the PDF version in Whova has some of the content blocked because we use some animations. So after the session, I will get it to the strategies folks, and hopefully they can move it forward to you with the full notes that are embedded. And then you can, if you have time, revisit the slides and take your time in reviewing some of the notes pages as well. Okay. So a couple of critical points, the idea that we can never force communities into prevention systems or collaboratives. Even if resources flow down from the federal government or the state, your county boards, your county commissioners, your aldermen, that doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean that the communities are ready for prevention. Communities, indeed people and groups, they have to value and see the mutual benefits of investing in and embracing community systems. So there are the issues of trust and navigating diversity and inclusion, attending to power structures and equity issues and historical systemic practices that have not facilitated trust and in fact have broken trust over the years with a diverse group of partners and neighbor and citizens that you live and work with every day, including your tribes, federally recognized or not. So true prevention has to in part originate through community process. The feds and the state have lots of resources and lots of skills around enabling and helping support community prevention, but it really has to come from the grassroots perspective, or it will not be tailored and utilized by those who benefit from it in the long run. So I want to make sure that you understand that this is not a top-down sort of scientific academic perspective on how community prevention happens. It's really this sort of both and from the grassroots up, and then how existing or evolving systems can support effective local community-based prevention. So we want to just sort of get you thinking. Let's imagine a community level, very integrated, culturally inclusive, fully supported prevention system that's focused on ensuring wellness across the lifespan. So this is a prevention system that is not just about reducing or intervening in child welfare system risk. This is also addressing adverse childhood experiences and adverse childhood environments and focusing on the wellness conditions. You could think about social determinants of health. or other frameworks that describe that. But think about that community system that would say, if we really truly had the supports that children and families need to reduce or mitigate risk and to support them when people come into risk conditions, what would that look like? It'll emphasize reducing those risk conditions about the child welfare engagement, but also those other wellness parameters that I'm talking about. But where would you begin? Would you start with things like the all county letters and the requirements, like 2083 or 153? Or would you start differently? How might we envision imagineering, if you will, a wellness or a community system? We have to start in a number of different ways, I recommend, by embracing a shared framework for guiding what a stage-based system model look like. There are sort of known ingredients that the literature points us to for successful community prevention coalitions. And I'm going to name 8 factors. They're not, it's not on the slides, they're in the notes pages, and I'll go back and revisit these in a later slide. But these 8 things are known from the prevention science literature to predict success in community prevention teams and community prevention systems when they're well done. So these 8 things are that first thing I just mentioned, a community that embraces a shared framework for guiding the step along the way. In other words, you have to be systematic about it. You have to know what you're looking for and build from step to step across various stages. Implementation is very much a stage-based way of doing business. The second element is inviting technical assistance where needed, given that so much of what's going on in the community prevention team process, building out FFPS and FFPSA, requires a ton of technical skill, financial systems, legal systems, cross-agency memorandum of agreement, information sharing that has to do with federal guidelines, local and state statutes. So there's a ton of technical, how you finance and claim reimbursements in the systems and so forth. So that technical assistance is important. It should not drive the system, it should support the system. And it should be invited in where necessary, not directing people how to do their work. The third element is really strong leadership and collaboratively developed shared vision. Emphasize collaboratively developed shared vision. The prevention system has to have mutually beneficial goals. If that vision and those goals are not mutually beneficial, it'll feel top down or it'll feel driven by particular agendas that will not be truly community centered. The fourth element is there has to be broad and diverse engagement of community partners. You guys know this. And those partners must have safe, vulnerable, brave spaces in order to attend to historical and system contexts. The fifth element is community readiness and capacities to perform well. There's a lot to building readiness. We're going to talk about some of that today, but I will venture and say many times, and some of the people on this Zoom session today have heard me say this. Organizations, including community collaboratives, coalitions, live or die. They succeed or fail by the readiness building and the exploration and preparation they do on the front end of what they get ready to do. Fully, the literature supports somewhere between 60 and 80% of the success of implementation happens through effective exploration, readiness building, and preparation. And if people rush into it and try to solve the technical problems required by federal, state, or local mandates without that readiness building, you run into all kinds of potential implementation problems. So that readiness building is really important. And it's okay that if you haven't done it, but if you're learning about it now, there are ways to go back and attend to it, even while you're sort of using that old metaphor of flying the plane while you're building it. The next element is really intuitive. Having strong, effective organization backbone support. Somebody has to do the work. Somebody has to do the technical work of running the business of that prevention coalition or a collaborative, the prevention team. 2083 and 2023, all those all county letters talk about the roles and the partners who need to be in those systems. But you know better than me, those nonprofit organizations, the informal family supports, the data needs that have to drive what's happening and informing the required reporting, the quality improvement. There's so many things that go in these prevention systems that have to be done, and so many of the technical that you need dedicated resources and support And they don't have to rest within one organization. You can have them across organizations if those organizations are well aligned. But these supports, these backbone supports, are often known as intermediary supports. They're the things that guide the day-to-day work and support both the governance of the system, sort of the decision-making side of it, and the service delivery aspect of the system, where things happen on the ground. So that's the sixth piece. The seventh piece is obvious. There has to be sustainable funding. Um, and usually that starts with what's doable on the front end, demonstrating success, and then growing your resources from there. The next is, and the last element is there has to be practical, effective, usable monitoring and evaluation systems. You absolutely can't do the required reporting, nor can you inform the two critical questions in implementation that you need to answer. Are we doing things the way that we designed and said we would do them? That's the first question. And the second question is, are we achieving the outcomes we hope to achieve? Your monitoring evaluation system should be created and enabled to answer those two questions. You don't have to have the Cadillac of evaluation systems in place from the get-go. You can do a lot of that continuous quality improvement in monitoring and learning through qualitative questions, brief check-ins with teams, spreadsheets, quick pulse surveys, focus groups. There are a lot of different ways to do that learning that can then where those data can be systematically brought together, analyzed, and reported back to the users across the system. So you don't have to have a college degree and a great technical assistance consultant coming in and doing all this work. You just have to have a plan and a practical, usable way to deliver that monitoring system. All right, early questions for the design process. You got to know who's going to be in what is this community you're talking about? Is it a community of children and families? Is it a community at large? Sometimes in community psychology, where I came from, we often think about community as place or race or geography or a census tract or a neighborhood or a set of blocks. But making sure that that community is well defined, both through mandate and through desire. Who wants to be in that community are critical questions. Whose voices are invited to plan and design it? What data will be collected to help to be used for decision making? So, what are the boundaries of these communities? What is the goal for citizen participation? Way too often we invite citizens to the table and ask things from us and don't resource them for being engaged in it. We don't give them credit for their lived expertise and experience. So it's really important to identify goals for citizen participation and create resources to encourage their ongoing engagement. What role does prior history play in creating this next culture of collaboration across system leadership? Because you guys know as well as I do, communities are very familiar with somebody coming in and telling them, we've got the next shiny object, the next best thing that somebody thought of that's going to help you. And guess what? They don't trust that, nor do they want it. They've been victimized by that far too many times. So helping, sort of tease out that culture, this idea of what historical systems roles have played and what that next level system of cross partnerships and collaboration need to look like, really critical. All that stuff take time. Some of you who've been around a long time may be familiar with Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. It's a really effective tool for identifying what do you want from me? If you come to me and ask me to engage in a community coalition or a collaborative, I need to know, are you trying to manipulate me for your gain? Are you trying to get me into some kind of therapy because you think something's wrong with me? Do you just want me to know about it by informing? Is my consultation important, which still is in the area of tokenism or placation? But how do you then move towards this position of engaging and authorizing citizen power by developing really well-defined, truly authentic partnerships, delegating power to these structures, and ultimately ceding some control? Now, those are really important decisions when you're in the early design of a prevention collaborative or coalition that must be solved. Because if you don't, you know what happens. The issues will crop up around, well, who gets to decide? Who gets a vote? How was that decided? Who even said that data was the data that we were supposed to use to make that decision? So you get all these conflicting questions around how the coalition or the collaboration will work. And if you don't do the work on the front end about really sort of building these questions out, then you will face those collaborative struggles as the work proceeds. I hope that makes sense. There are a lot of folks that have a question, a phrase in implementation science, this business about going slow to go fast. And people say, well, that all makes intuitive sense, but we've got a deadline. We've got to get our plan in by October 1st. We got to do this or that. That's a reality that implementation scientists recognize all the time. So you have to operate in a parallel plane. You have to acknowledge what the system is requiring from you. You have to talk about the implications of that and what it does to this trust building and the co-design process you need from authentic, well-engaged partners. And you put those issues on the table and you deal with them proactively with everybody having a say in how to manage that process because it affects everybody. So one team, one organization, one perspective doesn't dominate. You have to build in that conversation as part of the work. There's also, sorry, this looks a little cut off. Hopefully, the headline basically says using implementation science to create the enabling environment for success. So this is a well-known implementation equation that shows up in our practice literature in implementation science. And this applies to anything that's going to be implemented when it's well defined so that there are core ingredients or core components that are going to be delivered through your implementation practices. And this equation is pretty basic. It says the what time the how time the enabling context times the quality in which all of that is delivered um, um, equals the kinds of outcomes you're going to achieve. Now, notice in this equation, the key focus for our time today is what's in the highlighted enabling context circle. It's really important because that enabling environment is almost the driver for the rest of the stuff. Implementation is all about delivering usable innovations. They can be policies, they can be procedures, they can be practices, they can be evidence-based or evidence-informed practices, they can be pills, prescriptions, they can be programs. There are a number of things that can be implemented in community context. But what's critical is those things have to be well defined because they have to be teachable, learnable, coachable, and measurable. So that's what the what is about on this part of the equation. The how is how we support them, and that's the prevention infrastructure we're going to go through in the rest of this. But this enabling context is really about ensuring that these community partnerships, these design discussions, and this readiness building and capacity building are done well so that you can deliver with high quality. The thing I want to point out about this equation is notice the multiplication signs between each factor. If you go back to your elementary school math, what happens when something times something, there's a zero in the multiplication equation? If you multiply something by zero, what do you get? Put it in the chat. You get a zero. Thanks, Anjaru. You absolutely get a zero. So this is why each of these elements in implementation is so critical. Thank you for everybody putting things in the chat. You're exactly right. If you don't attend to each of these factors, you're going to significantly detriment and harm the likelihood of significant outcomes. So when you're building and planning your prevention teams and your prevention coalitions, these are the early conversations around what is it we hope to do? How will we expect to fully support it? How do we create the environment that that support happens? And then how will we have ongoing learning through the implementation quality factor to understand whether we're doing all the rest of it well? So by now you're probably going, whew, Robin, how do we do all this? How in the world do we accomplish this? It's complex. There are no easy answers to this. It takes deliberate leadership, very deliberate and intentional framework use, and working through these stages and these questions so that you have time to try to address them, given the pressures of the mandates that are on you. I get it. Please don't hurt the messenger. I totally get it. All right. You also have additional context. In your AB 153, there are funds that support your community prevention teams and your plans that really authorize your thinking across the full prevention continuum, universal or primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, and also encourages you building out on what's required in AB 2083, the cross-agency collaboratives and the other initiatives you have with your family resource centers, all of your early and head start things, and so forth. There's a lot of stuff in California that really emphasize a value placed on community-based prevention. Although I recognize that you get mixed messages and mixed mandates from all these all county letters, and sometimes it's hard to really sort of make it all fit together. The other thing I want to point out, of course, is what you already know, these 14 elements that are required in your prevention pathways. These are things that if you have been around the prevention block a couple of years, you should be familiar with. These are things that are required if you opted in to your CPV prevention planning in order to get the resources and the support from the state. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but this is also a set of, you could consider it a framework with a set of elements within that framework that round out what California considers to be a fully developed prevention continuum. Now, there are a couple things that I do want to emphasize that fit into the larger conversation we're having today. And these are things that you can obviously see without a whole lot of guidance. Having a well-developed theory of change, like if we're going to do prevention, what is it we expect to do to whom and in what way, and what results do we expect to get? If you can't say those things, you can't really define what success will look like for your team, your local prevention team. So having a well-developed theory of change that outlines the assumptions behind all this, the expectations for success, what kinds of resources, what kinds of outputs and outcomes should come from that, really critical. And then these other elements around, coordination of plans and cross-sector collaboration, assets and needs mapping. These are all sort of standard things that go into now what we know to be well-designed prevention coalitions. Feel free to drop questions. Okay, so the next few slides of in fact, the rest of this conversation, not much of a conversation, is it? I'm talking at you, but the rest of this time, we're going to actually work through this roadmap metaphor for building this out. And I hope you understand that this is not linear. You don't sort of progress from this from phase to phase without having to sometimes go back and revisit some of this. Why? Obvious reasons. I'm going to use my good friend Danny Morris, Dr. Danny Morris, as an example. He may be a key leader in Sacramento in a community prevention coalition. He may bring tremendous, and I know he does, leadership, resources, skills, knowledge, lived experience to that coalition. And the coalition may grow in leaps and bounds under his leadership. Danny may get another job. He may move out of state. Something may go on with his family. And that leadership will evolve into another person or persons who may need to take over that role. That may change the skill level or the vision or the opportunities for that leadership to continue maintaining the same high standard that Dr. Morris contributed to that coalition. So that's just one example of a context change. Oftentimes in child welfare, there's a heinous case, a child death, or a series of problems that your local community reacts to and lifts up a different set of priorities. So you're always reacting to the context and the timing of what happens in community prevention coalitions. That will never change. That's the same within your organization. You have to build that change management and that change flexibility into the coalition itself. So that's why this going through these stages and revisiting from time to time to embrace and affect this concept of readiness building and readiness rebuilding is very important. So we're going to start with this roadmap concept and think about the vision. And we're embedded in this roadmap framework is this common implementation framework. We refer to it as EPIS. It stands for exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. So this will be our planning framework within the roadmap metaphor for how you build out a community prevention coalition or a collaborative, if you will. I hope this makes sense. We're giving you a concrete framework within kind of a milestone metaphor, if you will, this roadmap metaphor, to help you think about each stage of building out an effective coalition. So let's talk about defining the vision. I'm going to tell you again that without adequate preparation and readiness building in this exploration phase, you're liable to set yourself up for some serious setback, if not failure. This is where in fact, most, not much, most of the important work begins. And this is also the initial phase of all implementation frameworks. You have to understand what's being asked of the system, what's being asked of the agencies and the partners, what data are being brought to the table to define the problems and so forth. So there's a lot baked into this particular milestone. You have to define the desired prevention system. We already addressed that in the earlier slides. And that all has to happen in conversation and community context. Multiple cultures have to be at that table and so forth. I'm not going to read the whole slide. I'm just going to point out that by inviting those conversations, bounding the community, tackling the difficult challenges around power and resources and all that sort of stuff that we've already mentioned. Envisioning what roles and responsibilities and structures will have to be there to achieve success. All of that stuff is going to be critical. Taking the time to work through these really critical, complex issues and ensuring mutual benefits for everybody. Not just saying this is what's required, but this is what we're all agreeing our values, our principles, what we believe to be our shared success. That just has to happen. If not, you're gonna create real problems down the road. The planning team will have to make sure that you create, if this can't be done within the mandate for getting something down on paper, you have to create parallel processes for continuing to have these discussions while you're also beginning the technical aspects of the work. There's no other way. It can take effective coalitions 3 to 5 years to do this work. It really can take a long time. So you have to adjust your expectations about what this can look like. Okay, let's go back to our roadmap because the next level of work is you have to, okay, now that we define what success looks like, who are our partners, what the community is, then we got to say, well, what does that community need? And is it ready for us? Is this the right time? What are the right resources? Who are the right people? What are the right programs and processes? All that comes into this next milestone. And it looks sort of like that. This is the graphic I mentioned was covered up in the PowerPoint. One way to frame an understanding of what this entire prevention system looks like, and this is a second framework we're offering you, is something that we call the Modified Interactive Systems Framework. Because even if you're operating in a small church in Sonoma, California, there's still going to be three elements of a prevention system that will impact what you're doing in that small church. So let's sort of unpack this. In the modified interactive system framework, there's going to be leaders who make decisions. They're going to figure out how do we acquire resources? Who sets policy? These are what's sometimes referred to as the governance systems. In a local prevention collaborative, that might be your leadership team. It might be your cross-system partnership group that agrees to take on doing the policies and procedures and setting forth how decisions get made, how power is shared, who speaks what languages, and how data are analyzed to inform the critical things that need to be done. So that's the sort of upper tier or the leadership decision-making system. In the middle of this is the support system. It connects the leaders who are making decisions and the policies that are being designed to support the system with those doing the work. So the support system builds capacities for all those people and agencies and partners who are in the work, providing implementation support all along the way. And implementation support is a broad set of functions that we don't have time to go into today. But their job in the interactive system framework is to provide support up and down, to give resources and abilities to the delivery system, the doers, the practitioners. Now, I'm not just talking about people who are getting paid. I'm also talking about those informal supports, those people who need a quick babysitting session so somebody can get to a therapy appointment or a medical appointment or their pregnancy check. So we're talking about the informal supports and the formal supports. So the support system connects both up and down. But when you think about designing a community prevention system, this is a way of thinking about, well, are we tending to the leaders and managers who are going to help us decide how things are going to have to run? And are we building out a delivery system that's going to make sure people get what they need? And oh, by the way, are we putting in the backbone and implementation supports to make all that go forward? Does that make sense? That's kind of an oversimplified but quick way of describing how you can think about the elements within this system. All right, moving along. In order to assess context, thank you for the responses in the chat. In order to assess context, there's some things, of course, that you know need to happen. Really, we can't overestimate conducting historical practices and data reviews. I could tell you, I went into many communities, many of them, if not most of them, marginalized in my earlier career. And I got told in no uncertain terms, in fact, I had weapons pointed at me um, in certain communities, that if I was trying to bring something they didn't want, or if I was trying to talk them into something that they didn't see value in, I could get the HU double hockey sticks out of their community and never come back. So these historical data reviews and practices, engaging the right partners, really matter. Taking care of the narratives and the stories and how to figure out what they need and if they'll even work with you. Engaging in those broad conversations. Why this? Why now? What's required? What's desired? What worked in the past? How can we at least build on something to get started? How do we commit to a prevention system for everybody? And then use available or build capacity assessments. This is that resource mapping component that 2083 required. I mean, the CPP plan, prevention plan required. And hopefully you'll uh, thanks. I appreciate that, Tina. Hopefully, you'll be able to develop some qualitative data along with some. There are a lot of historical metrics in your system, you guys know. Not all of them in child welfare. Some of them come from housing, finance systems, chamber of commerce, behavioral health, schools, education. There are a lot of data points that can help you with this needs and gap assessment. Okay, moving along to the next milestone. Once you assess your context, define your vision, bounded your community and all the things that we've talked about so far, the next thing you're going to do is decide what are we going to do now that we know who we're dealing with and what that community looks like. What will we do and how will we do it? So you'll use the data and the stories and the narratives to marry up with those mandated programs and services that you're being asked to take on. What are the available funding streams? What are those legal factors and other resources you got to take into account? What are those existing or desired linkages between services so that you can build out this continuum of care, make it a true system of care? Most prevention efforts, if successful, begin with defining these usable, fundable, doable elements. They start with what's achievable, and then they build out from there. Mainly because that's where the resources are. What gets funded gets done, right? But communities really require more than that. They require really innovative, creative ways. In my former community life, we went to several churches in my community where we were able to persuade them to let us use their family meeting centers for parent training and for community meetings for a relationship building. We would get people to bring in potlucks and we would put children in another room and bring in entertainment for them and ask for people to swap out. I did my share of babysitting. I literally would be one of the people that would provide childcare in some of these community meetings as my contribution because we felt like everybody needed to swap out these roles. So there are a lot of resources in continuum of care that have to be noodled on and figured out. There are implementation tools when you start to think about evidence-based practices. I know that you all have to choose from the from the registry. And so you may be told, like motivational interviewing and functional family therapy or MST and stuff like that. But there may be other EBPs or evidence-informed practices or even promising programs that you want to take on. And for those, of course, you'll have to find some evaluation funds. But remember, implementation science is all about supporting the deliverable of usable things. You don't want to put things in your plan that you can't effectively deliver. And what we mean by that is you can't train them. You can't teach people what to do, and you can't measure them if they're not observable, teachable, coachable, and measurable. So you want to make sure that they're well developed. Implementation science can inform how to do that, and we don't have time to get into the nuts and bolts of that. But this is where, in this stage of it, where you're actually choosing what you're going to take on and building that out into your service array for your continuum of practice. This next piece is about building the infrastructure to support it. Remember the equation, creating the enabling environment and the quality around how implementation happens. This is where that goes on. So you're going to build and adapt capacities to ensure the processes and policies to make success happen. All right, so what does that look like in practical ways? What do we mean by this term infrastructure? That's a fancy term that gets thrown around in implementation. But the nuts and bolts of it is, do we really have to do all this stuff? Yes. These are the components of effective implementation in a community team or community continuum of care that have to be in place. Now, they don't all have to be in place at one time, and it's always going to be ebb and flow as to what gets done and what gets perfected along the way. Good community coalitions have the tolerance for the changes that come along when programs ebb and flow because you'll never have everything you need, and you'll always have things you want, but you want to build in this infrastructure that supports whatever you take on. So these are things like team structures. Remember that interactive system framework I just showed you, a leadership team, implementation support team, the planning team. You might have a resource development team. You might have a communication team. So you're going to have all kinds of teams or committees or work groups that are going to be in this work. And you want to link them together through feedback and sharing and feed forward tools to make sure that everybody can co-plan, co-design, and learn how things are going along the way. There are things like team charters and project plans and policies, procedures. MOAs that I'm sure you guys are sick of by now, for those of you who have been in this, but these interagency groups, memorandum of agreement of understanding that outline how people are going to work and solve complex problems like information sharing or data systems and so forth. Then there's how you bring people up to competency in doing what they're doing. This includes even informal supports. Who who coaches the coaches? Like if you have violence interrupters in your community who are folks who are returning back from prisons and you're using them as credible messengers, who sort of supports them and teaches them in a culturally appropriate, relevant way how to do that well and still building on their strengths so that you're maximizing their skills, but also doing a best practice in violence and interruption. Those are important skills that have to be built into workforce development systems. And how do you coach that? And then how do you figure out whether that's going well through fidelity assessment or monitoring and so forth? So those are workforce development issues. Then there's monitoring. I already sort of hammered home that point. How do you know what you're implementing how do you know whether you're implementing well? And how do you know whether your programs are achieving their results? And then, of course, the hardest thing that we do in human services, in fact, all relationships, is communications. But it's important to document and develop communications processes and protocols and tools through collaborative engagement with all our partners that make sure that people get what they need to know in the way, in the form that they best can use it, and can bring that data back for problem solving and celebrating what you accomplish in terms of the wins you achieve. And then there's systems that ensure services supporting all the things that we value: cultural, tribal, linguistic diversity, really hammering away at equity and inclusion to make sure that the right voices are in the right places through these power sharing things that we've already taken care of and brought them to the table to handle. And then there are services that support children and families in their natural environments. Okay, we're getting to the home stretch here. What about how we deliver these services and practices? This is the day-to-day work. This is that delivery system that was at the bottom of the interactive system framework. This is where where the work happens, but this is also a real danger point in your prevention planning and your prevention system because this requires that communication, the feedback that I just mentioned. Far too often, community prevention teams and planning coalitions delegate this work to the agencies, to the backbone groups, and then they come to meetings where there's reporting out, but there's really no engagement around how well things are working. What are you hearing from the people that are receiving these services? Are they getting their needs met? Are there things that can be done to improve? So the leadership and the implementation teams have to be engaged in this delivery stuff. Otherwise, it'll all get delegated to the agencies and their implementation problems will get buried within the service agencies. And when that happens, the continuum will fall apart because people won't work together to solve what's causing those problems. So this is a really critical part of the continuum of care for prevention coalitions. You got to have that feedback mechanism and all that. Everybody should have very clear roles and responsibilities, and the implementation teams have to understand and monitor what's going on well and report that back to the leadership, the co-creation, and the co-design partners along the way. Last but not least, I know you're getting a lot of stuff right and you're going to have big wins in your work. So then there's going to be this question of sustainment. How do you build what works to live on, and to celebrate your success? So there are ways, there are sustainability frameworks. But there is no surprise here. Obviously, you want to celebrate the great things you accomplish. Lift up, especially community partners. Tell those stories of success. Who solved their medical crisis? Who got housing? Who got a job? Who went back to school? Who completed their certification? Who didn't go into the child welfare system? And all those things. Who's in recovery now? There's so many things to celebrate when prevention goes well. How are you managing the adversity that's facing families and systems? Reinforcing that collaboration and those local leadership efforts and effective power sharing, all this hard work you did on the front end, celebrate it, lift it up, and talk about why it's working. But then there's this idea of making sure that data is continuously coming back. This is another danger point, because it's easy to say, that whole community thing is humming along pretty well. Um, we don't have to meet as often. We'll let the agencies kind of keep cruising along. If that happens, danger, danger, danger. You guys aren't old enough to remember that series Lost in Space. But they used to have a robot, and he would say anytime there was something dangerous to the family, he'd go, "Danger, Will Robinson." That was the lead character in the series. He'd scream, "Danger, danger." So every time a community coalition starts to get comfortable because it looks like things are in place, I want you to raise the red flag of, are we paying attention? Because it's our tendency to let that go down into the agencies or not talk about the things that commonly trip us up. So there are sustainability frameworks that have you go back and recheck. Do you have the right capacities in place? Are your implementations well developed and being well delivered? Are the right resources being matched to the right problems? Are your data answering the right questions we need to answer? And are people feeling properly engaged and reinforced for their efforts at being in these coalitions? Are we actually learning and improving our work as we go along? Okay, I've just given you the prescription for the whole deal. So I've given you a metaphor, a roadmap for how to stage it out. We've given you the EPIS framework for the 4 stages of how to plan it. And we've given you the interactive systems framework to think about the levels in the system that will help guide you into thinking about what pieces and parts go into this prevention support system. Now, your job, of course, is to figure out how CPP and requirements in California fit into all that. But I want to leave, we've got about 10 minutes left in our session, or a few minutes anyway. So and I'd love for you to lean in with your lived experience, your lived expertise. What of this resonated with you? Maybe share your successes with other partners in the session today, or possible questions. So Angelica, I'll also ask for your help in helping me facilitate some of this. Open mic. Anybody have questions, reflections? What seemed to resonate? Where do you want to share your success with other partners in the room, so forth?
I thank you, Robin, sorry about that. I'm Lydia Lopez with Ventura County, and I just want to say I wish that I had seen these slides before I was told that I was going to be overseeing the wellness system or the implementation of our comprehensive prevention plan in Ventura County. It might have been helpful. Although sometimes we also know that sometimes it's a lot of theory and a lot of ideas that are coming at us in the beginning. So it's who knows how much of it would have stuck, right? So to hear it now, it's like, yeah, this all makes sense. And I really appreciate up on the top of one of the slides it says it's not linear, something about it not being linear. And I thought that is so true. And I would just say that as we're in Ventura County really um trying to move along, we're at the place now where we are really trying to we have actually a community pathway pilot that's going to be launched at the first week of March, but that's a pilot. We want to design a community pathway uh model, right, for Ventura County. And so we're at the stages of looking at all of the elements and what would it mean and how do we share the data and all of that. But we have really good partnership. And one of the things that I keep saying, and I say it because not only do I want to remind others as we are leading this effort, but also to remind myself that it's we have to remember this is a new concept. It's great, it's good, but there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to be okay. We really have to practice those adaptive leadership skills where we're saying, wait, hold on, wait a minute. Maybe this wasn't, maybe we need to take a step back and really rethink how we want to do this. For instance, we had a family level data work group that was is part, and we thought, oh, maybe it was too soon that we created that group because now they're kind of, it feels like there might be some redundancy or some confusion as to whose role is it to do this, whose role is it to do that. So we recently had a conversation where, and that's where it's really valuable to have such great working relationships across to make sure you're building those partnerships, because when you come across those things, you have to be able to say, hey, wait a minute. There has to be enough trust to be able to say, oh, look, maybe we went too soon, we went too fast. Let's back up a little bit. What do we think of doing it this way? So I appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydia. Always a gift to see you. Thanks for coming and for sharing those perspectives. You do amazing work in your community and through your own leadership. Um, and I want to just reflect back that those kernels that she just offered, those wisdom kernels, are just so true. You guys have all heard this idea of I see April. I'll get to it in just a second. This idea of change happens at the speed of trust, right? Trust is that most essential ingredient. If you can't establish trust within and among your partners, um, you really won't make much progress. And so, a fundamental self-regulation. What we mean by self-regulation is, sometimes when you're working with your children and they engage in a behavior and they need some correction or they need to change what they're doing, you often sit them down and you ask them, um, did you see what happened? What did you just do? Did you see how it worked out? Are there any things that you could have done differently to get a different result? Right? So you try to teach children to do this self-reflection so that they learn executive control over their behaviors and to get better results in life. Organizations, committees, teams use the same self-regulation strategies to pay attention to their, what we tend to refer to as their hygiene, how they're building trust, how they're relating to each other. You folks know 100% of the success in life that we experience is predicated on our ability to build and maintain effective relationships. 100% of it. Because if those relationships don't have a buy-in, they don't see the relative advantage of being a partner with you, they're not going to come to the table. Or if they do, they're going to come reluctantly. They're not going to contribute. They're not going to bring their strengths, their skills, their assets. And these problems are so complex that we need everybody. There's so many different ways to solve these complex problems, but often we don't even know what we don't know. We don't know even how to ask the question. So having this trust, these relationships in place is the quintessential requirement for all of this work to go on. And going back up to the comment I saw in the chat about the importance of celebrating community partnerships. You may smile when I tell you this, but there is a literature and implementation science that demonstrates that when you sit down with people and you share food, you get better implementation outcomes. You know why? Obvious reasons. First, people have to care enough to come. They have to trust you enough that they're going to eat your food or they're going to co-eat your food. And it becomes an informal environment where people can kind of just begin to let their hair down. Yes, Tina, it is. So it turns out that we, in our own practice model at UNC where I work, the very first thing we do when we build out implementation support contracts is we try to arrange on-site meetings with people where we can just get to know each other and share food. Because once we do that, we start that trust building and that questioning and that navigation process that needs to happen. And it's even harder to do in communities because there's so many different, there's, diverse cultures and contexts and languages and so forth. So Lydia just offered up a lot of wisdom about the importance of that and why, if there's a stumble along the way, you got to go back and ask, how do we attend to this? How do we either build new trust or rebuild the old trust? Yep, thanks for the comments. Let me go back to April's question. Sustain, how do you scrap something? Let me see. I'm sorry, the chat's a little bit off my screen. Oh, okay. How do you stop something without offending the person who put the work into it? That is that the right? So if something's in the plan or somebody's doing something is not working, how do you stop doing that in favor of something different? Is that the question?
Yes, without offending the person who put all the work into it.
Yeah. Well, April, you didn't have to add that last part. No, I'm teasing. I get the complexity of that. That's a challenge. My answer to all that is one of the ways that reduces the tension in the room is when you take the time to co-design the monitoring and evaluation system, and there's mutual agreement on what data elements are going to inform whether something's working or not, then they've got stake in the game. They've been at the table to decide how success or failure is going to get measured. And then there's less of their ability to be in conflict. If they've agreed on a data system that says, this thing is not working so well, then you invite them back in. What can we do to either change what we're doing to achieve the results that this program is designed to achieve? How do we understand what's not going well? Is it an implementation problem? Is it an enabling environment problem? Is it that the program is not well developed and well designed? Is it not a usable it? So asking those questions in partnership with the person who has that stake can guide a thorough exploration of the strengths and weaknesses of how things are working. So you try to make it data driven, objective, and use a framework for going through this. And you don't just pick out that one program. You look at maybe several programs or all the programs, and you put them through that same process so that people don't feel threatened about their favored program. Does that get to it?
Yes, it does. That was actually really good advice. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for asking the question. Thanks, Tina. So we've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 more minutes. Anybody else want to lean in into how their community prevention teams are working, where this makes sense, where you have words of advice for others who are leaning into this, maybe in a fresher place?
Well, I want to thank you for your presentation. It really had me thinking about some things that we're doing in Sacramento and how we can enhance the work we're doing, especially around 2083 and a few other things related to child welfare. You really helped me personally see some areas where we can really build up and enhance what we're doing. And so I may reach out later on for a discussion with my team and you, if possible.
Sure. Thank you for the kind words, and I appreciate that there's, useful content for you. I know from my experience with Dr. Morris and so many, I've been working in some way in California now for better than 8 years, almost 9 years. So I'm really appreciative of the really hard work that's going on in the counties. But Danny, I'm happy to help if I can. So please feel free to do that. Tina, I see your hand. You want to come off mute and jump in?
It just kind of reiterates the importance of just collaborating with communities and with other agencies that are out there. I myself live in a very small county, and so there are limited, resources. So there is a big advantage to having good working relationships with those different organizations. So that way, when you kind of come back to the drawing board when something's not working, if there's a gap for services, if it's not within your scope of work or within your funding capabilities, having those networks and connections can become beneficial, and you can create a partnership and kind of fill that gap for services in the community.
You bet. I love that you leaned into that smaller county context too. This all sounds big and fancy, but the fact is, when you break it down into pieces and parts, it's really not that hard to do. The thing is that it's just systematic. It's moving through stages and being very intentional about what you're paying attention to. And so it helps whether you're in a Los Angeles or a much smaller community in rural California. And I always recommend start with the doable. The state's only going to expect you to be able to do what you can do within the resources and the context that you have in your county, and make use of the resources that are available to you. Don't try to tackle the moon if you can only begin to just get to the top of the mountain right now. Let's see, Alyssa, do you have tips on navigating when things sound really good on paper, but the interactions still seem disconnected? Uh, I do. Some of it's a personal reflection, and some of it's an implementation science informed perspective. Um, Something's giving you feedback as to whether things are not working as well as they might appear on paper. So beginning with what's giving you that impression, or what is it, data? Is it personal feedback? Or is it observations in meetings around relationships or processes? Usually, when I find myself in a position of um, disagreement or discord between what people say is going on and what's actually going on, I like to invite personal conversations. I might start with somebody and, say, I noticed this, or I'm hearing from the people that I work with that even though we say this is happening, it's kind of working differently in this way or in this community. Have you heard that? So I try to lift it up in a personal, informal way, not as a threat, but as a way to begin a mutual exploration of the ideas. I don't like to do that in a meeting, of course, because people feel threatened. It's often a formal environment where their performance is on view. And so I might start with a phone call or even an invited coffee with somebody, um, trying to build a relationship or an informal opportunity to explore what I'm seeing versus what people say are happening. And there may be other like-minded people who are experiencing the same thing. You're not trying to generate civil unrest. What you're trying to do is align perspectives. I always go back to the data. What do the data say? And do the data really align with lived experience on the ground? How do you know? Because one of the fundamental questions in implementation, are we collecting the right data? The essential questions in implementation data gathering is, what do you need to know and how will you need to learn it? And how will you apply what you're learning to answer the questions you need to answer? So if the data you're collecting aren't answering the questions about are things really working well on the ground or in the way that they're designed, then you're collecting either insufficient data or partial data that don't get you the answers you need. So revisiting the data question is also a way to get at that. I think we're down to our last moment. Any closing? By the way, in the rest of the slide deck, I built a table that helped me think through, the kind of things that I showed in the other content slides. Um, so thank you for your time. I have tremendous gratitude oops, um, for your time and your attention and your questions. And I will offer again, if anybody needs some additional clarification or follow-up, uh, please let me know. I'm happy to help you if I can.